Hey, hi guys. So in our today's video, we'll see how we can use a Power Automate flow to approve documents from multiple SharePoint document libraries and multiple SharePoint sites. So it will be a single Power Automate flow which would run for all document libraries in a single SharePoint site, and it can be also used for multiple SharePoint sites. So why we need this flow? The problem which I faced or which we face is with the current triggers available in Power Automate, SharePoint triggers, we cannot access or we cannot use those triggers with multiple document libraries. It takes only a single input at a single time. So very commonly used solution for this is creating and duplicating the flow for different document libraries. This is not a very efficient solution. Hence, in this video, we'll see how we can use a single on-demand flow for all the SharePoint document libraries and sites. So we'll be triggering this flow on click of a button for the selected document in the SharePoint document library. In this video, we'll see how to set up that button in the SharePoint document library and how we can set up a single Power Automate flow to run on all the document libraries and all SharePoint sites. I will also answer some commonly asked questions which I've gathered from the Power User community and Dynamics community. So without any further ado, let's jump on to the demonstration. So this is our document library in Power Platform Experts SharePoint site. I've already created a few documents of different type. Before I could show you the actual implementation part of this, I'll just quickly show you how this process works. So we have a document approval button over here. The user will click on this document approval button. Once the user clicks on this document approval button, a side screen will appear. Now, once the side screen has loaded, the requester would be able to select the approve. So I have added email addresses here. You can add names as well. So I'll just select myself and I will click run. Once we run the flow, if we refresh the document, we will see that the document for which we requested approval is now in pending state. In some time, I'll be receiving an approval for this document. Now, if I go to my approval screen over here, you will see that I have already received an approval which I just requested for the Excel workbook. I will just hit approve. The final status is completed. Now, if we go back to our document library, if we reload, we see that the document has been approved. If we check the mailbox, the requested user has received an email which says your document library has been approved by your manager. So this is how our process would work. So let's begin with the implementation. So first thing that you need to do is to enable content approval for this document library in this SharePoint site. To do that, click on the gear icon, go to library settings, go in more settings, go in versioning settings. In versioning settings, toggle this section to yes and this section to create major and minor draft. Hit OK. We will go back to our document library. Once the content approval setup is done, you will see an approval status column in here. If you are still not seeing that approval status column, just refresh the tab and you will be able to see that approval status column. The next step is to create a custom column which will hold our send approval button, that is our request approval column. To create that, just click on add columns, select text, click next, name anything as per your preference. I'll name it request approval and click save. I have already created it, hence I won't create it one more time. Once you have created this column, all you need to do is go in, click on the column, go in column settings, go and format this column. In format this column, you will see this section in formatted columns. This section is directly not visible. You need to click on advanced mode. I will show you by clicking on some other column. So if we go in column settings of this, in formatted columns, you see this advanced mode. When you click on this advanced mode, you get this section over here. Now we go back to our request approval column. In column settings, we go in formatted columns. In this section, you need to type the JavaScript code which will call our flow and which will create a button in this column. So this is the JavaScript code. Now in this JavaScript code, you need to pass the flow's ID, the flow which you will be calling by clicking that button. I won't be explaining this JavaScript in this video. There are many people who have written blogs on this. One of them is Microsoft MVP Laura Rogers. I'll put a link to her blog which explains this JavaScript very well. Moving forward, once you have pasted this JavaScript in here, just hit save and you are ready. So our SharePoint site setup is ready. Now let's go to our Power Automate flow. Now the button which we created, in that button we passed the flow ID. You get the flow ID from here in this URL. This is the flow ID which we passed in the JavaScript. Now that button will call this flow. When you are creating this flow, you need to keep certain things in mind. Do remember to share this flow with the users who will be requesting the approvals and the users whose connection you will be using in this flow. By that I mean, if you see there is a run only user section in here. If you click on edit, you will see connections used. So for the SharePoint connection, you need to use an admin, a global admin, a SharePoint global admin's connection. That connection or that user connection, that user should be able to approve documents on SharePoint. This will ensure that our flow runs seamlessly. You can also use any support emails Outlook connection if you wish to send emails through any support email like service desk or something like that. For approvals, just keep it provided by run users only. Once the SharePoint connector and the Outlook connector is set to the admin connection reference, just hit save. So that's done. Now let's move on to our trigger. So we are using for a selected file trigger. These inputs in here are placeholder values. So since this is required, we need to add some values in it. You can add any site's address and any library names ID in here. So how exactly do we make this flow run for multiple document libraries, or how does this flow run for multiple SharePoint sites? The thing is, if you see that all of the SharePoint triggers and action have one thing in common: the site address and the library name. If somehow we are able to get the site address and the library name dynamically, we will be able to pass this site address and this library name in all of the other SharePoint actions which we will be using in this flow. So that's how we make this flow run dynamically or run for multiple document libraries and multiple SharePoint sites. So once this flow is triggered from the button, what we see is this is the successful flow run which we just triggered. So if you see in the show raw output, if you see in the body of this trigger, you will see that the input provided by the JavaScript to this trigger is the ID, the item URL, the field name and the field ID. So this item URL is the URL of the item for which this flow has been triggered. So this item URL is very important. Now if you look carefully in this item URL, you will see that we can access the SharePoint site URL from this item URL. Let's go back to our SharePoint site. I have opened an editable document, that is a PDF document and a Word document for this SharePoint site. Now if you closely see in the PDF documents URL, you will see that after 5 forward slashes you can get the SharePoint site's address, and after 6 forward slashes you can get the document library's ID. Similarly, for a Word document, after 5 slashes you get the SharePoint site's address, but after the 6th slash you get layouts written. So by this we know that we can get the document library's URL, the document library's name from the PDF documents URL, and you can get the SharePoint sites URL from even the PDF documents URL and the Word documents URL. In the Word document URL, we also have the file ID. This file ID is the ID of this Word file. So why this file ID is important? Now the SharePoint site URL is constant, it will never change, but the SharePoint document library name can change, and using SharePoint document library name is not efficient because, for example, while creating this document library, I had named it flow design. That's why you see in the document library URL, the name of the document library appears as flow design. Now, if I change this name to say flow design new, and if I save this, if I refresh, this name still stays to the original name which was there while creating this SharePoint site. I will refresh this again, the new name came and the original name still stays. So this is inconsistent and this can cause our flow to fail. So that's why we don't use the document library's name. Instead, we use the file ID to get the document library's ID. So in case of Word documents or in case of documents with layouts in the URL, you can directly get the file ID of the document from the URL. But in case of PDF documents, you need to pass the path of the document to get the file ID of the document. Now let's go to our Power Automate flow. So for a selected file, we can get the document library name by processing the URL. This is the expression which I'm using to process the URL. I won't be explaining this. I've written a blog on this. So that blog will help you process expressions like experts. And that blog is how to use format data by examples, how to build expressions using formatted data. So I won't be explaining the expressions in this blog. But in the descriptions, I'll be putting all the expressions which I'm using in this flow. So from this, for a selected file, we get the document library URL and the document library name. So we get the document library URL from the item URL, which we get from the for a selected file trigger. We have a hard-coded variable saved, which is notification list. The value is email notification. So what is this? So I've created audit log in here which stores the data of the documents which were approved by this document approval process, and the name of that list I have stored in this hard-coded value. This is not necessary to do, but it was required for my requirement, hence I did it. We define a variable file GUID. Now, like I showed you, once we have processed the file URL, we can get the library name or we can get layouts. So if we get the library name, we can just create the file path using the library name, pass the file path for getting the file metadata, and from the file metadata, we can get the file's GUID. If we don't have the file name and if layouts is written in here like we saw in our Word document, so when layout is written in the documents in the file's URL, we have observed that we can get the file name directly from that file's URL. So that's what we are doing here. We are decoding the library URL, we are processing that decoded library URL, and we are getting the file ID. And we are setting our global variable, which was the file ID, with the output of this get file ID. All of these expressions I'll be putting in the description, so no need to worry about that. Once we get the file ID, now it's time to get our document library's GUID. So for that, we use an API, a SharePoint API. So we pass the document libraries URL, which we got from the item URL in our earlier step, and we use this API. Again, I will be putting this API in the description box of this video below. From this API, we get the document library's name. We use that document library's name in all of our, that document library's ID in all of our SharePoint actions below. Now, if you see, I am setting the content approval to submitted. So what happens is that sometimes if we process any document and that document is in pending state, the content approval state might stuck. So to make sure that the document is in processing or the document has been sent for approval, you need to make sure that the content approval is set to submitted. So when the document is approved or rejected, while you are setting the content approval for approved or rejected documents, that content approval stage will not stuck. This content approval stage also stucks in loop or infinite loop when the user doesn't have permission to set the content approval. That's why we run all the SharePoint actions with SharePoint global admins connections. So we set the content approval, we start and wait for the approval, that is we send the approval. Once we get the approval, we set the content approval to approved. If the outcome is approved, we set the content approval to rejected if the outcome is rejected, and we notify the users. Once this is done, I create an audit log. This audit log helps me to track which all documents are approved and rejected and who approved them. Now this is completely optional, you can end your flow here. This is just for tracking the document. This is just a SharePoint list, and these are the columns, custom columns, which I have added in that SharePoint list, and I'm just updating those columns by the values which I get from this flow. So let's see our inputs. So we triggered the flow, we got our item URL in the for a selected file trigger. We processed our document library record, document library URL. We got the document library URL from this item URL. We got the document library name from the items URL. Now here we have the document library name as layouts. We set the hard-coded notification, the audit log list name. We set the file GUID. Now since the document library's name is layout, we are processing the document library URL. That is, we have decoded this, and if you see here in the source doc, we have the file's ID. We process that decoded URL, we get the file ID, and we set the file ID. Now by using the file ID, we are getting the document library's GUID. Now how we get that document library's GUID? If you see in the raw outputs, in the body of the HTTP request, under list all fields, in parent list we have a field called ID, and this ID is our document library's ID, and we will be using this document, and we are using this document ID for processing our SharePoint actions in the flow. Now once we get our document library ID, which was this one, we set the content approval to submitted, we send the approval, and since the approval was approved, we set the content approval to approved, and we send a notification to the team, and audit log is created. Now since we saw an example with layouts, let's see an example with non-editable files, that is our PDF files or an image file. I will go to my site, and in the earlier example we ran the flow with the original document library name. In this example we have changed the document library name, so we are also covering that use case. So if I click in here, if I send an approval, I will shortly receive an approval. I did receive the approval. It was for a document PDF. This time I will reject it. If you now go in the SharePoint site, if you reload, this this document has been rejected. If you go in the emails, you see the rejected email. Now if we go in our flow, if we refresh this, if we see the latest run, if we go in layout, the library name is not layout. If you see, it says flow designs, and we are using that library name to create the folders path, which is the SharePoint site URL / the document library name and the file name of the file. We are using this URL to get the metadata of that file. Now in this metadata we have this as the file ID, that is the E tag contains the file ID. We are processing the E tag, and once we process that E tag we get the file ID. We use that file ID to get our document library's ID, and in the list item fields, in parent lists, we have our document library's ID, and we use that document library's ID to process all the actions in our flow after these steps. So that's how our flow runs. So in this manner, so all you need to do to make this flow run for multiple document libraries and in multiple SharePoint sites, just create a button in the document library and just pass the flow ID in that button's JavaScript, and that would make it run for multiple SharePoint document libraries and in multiple SharePoint sites. Thank you.